Okay, we are going to look at chapter 4, and it is about the American Revolution. But just prior to the American Revolution, we had a few wars that helped to prepare the colonists. Well, it actually put the colonists in debt financially to the British government, which caused them to want to tax the colonists, which then caused the colonists to get angry. And that's the back information as to why we're going to look at this. So, early problems, the French and Indian War, rivals for an empire. Constant fighting. Britain and France fought 4 wars against each other during the 16 and 1700s. The last of those 4 wars was the French and Indian War. It was really funny, too, because these wars had one name in Europe and one name in the colonies, but they pretty much decided French and Indian War for this one. What was at stake? The main piece of land that Britain and France were fighting for was the Ohio River Valley. My mother's from this area, so it was important in my life. What did each side want? Well, France wanted beaver furs due to their popularity in Europe, and Britain wanted more land to colonize and expand the British Empire and make money. So, in March 1775, there's just a political cartoon of some of what the women were doing to fight against the colonists. But before that, or to fight against the British, before that, what I'd like you to look at is Fort Duquesne, where Fort Duquesne was a French fort located at present-day Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. You remember William Pitt was the person that area is named for. The fort controlled the Ohio River Valley. 3 rivers are there as 2 smaller ones come together. That's why it's called Three River Stadium, where the where Pittsburgh Steelers used to play. If they don't play there anymore, I don't know. But Washington and Fort Necessity. So George Washington was an ambitious 22-year-old colonel during the French and Indian War. Fort Necessity was a British fort about 60 miles from Fort Duquesne. July 1754, the French defeated Washington's army. The losses were so substantial that Washington was forced to surrender. Think about that fact. The U.S. will go to France for help during the American Revolution, making enemies friends eventually, just a few years later, about 20 years later. Edward Braddock led a group of troops to attack Fort Duquesne, but was ambushed by the French and Indians, who used a new type of warfare called guerrilla warfare. And this is something the colonists learn. Sometimes if you watch The Patriot, you'll see Mel Gibson using this guerrilla warfare tactic where he does that, and he's called the Ghost, because he learns to fight the way the Native Americans fought. And what is guerrilla warfare? Where you use your surroundings to help you fight, to ambush your opponents from all angles. Britain was not used to this style of warfare. If you look at the picture above, you look at what they really like to do, which is line up, meet your opponent, like on a football field, as they line up. They were typically fought in straight lines across established battlefields. Battles had rules, and the French were not following them. And so this, of course, makes it very difficult for them to fight that type of enemy. On this particular slide, you can see William Pitt and the Iroquois. William Pitt planned to assemble the largest, best-equipped army ever seen in North America. His goal was to have 50,000 soldiers. He is remembered for the famous quote, "I know I can save this country." And when does the tide turn? Well, under Pitt's command, the British start winning some battles. This made the powerful Iroquois tribe want to support them. And at the Battle of Quebec, a surprise attack by the British Army. The British fleet, under the command of General James Wolfe, sailed up the St. Lawrence River and successfully attacked Quebec City. Although fighting continues after this attack, the Battle of Quebec is considered a major turning point in the French and Indian War. Now, if you look at the languages spoken in Canada, in Quebec, or Quebec, they speak French. And so you can see who settled that particular area. The war comes to an end with the Treaty of Paris. I have in brackets, there will be a lot of these because the same title, Treaty of Paris, will be the treaty used to end several of wars, including the American Revolution. The document was signed in 1763 that ended the French and Indian War and stated that France lost most of the land in North America. Chief Pontiac, there to the right, a Native American leader that was convinced to go to war with Britain. Pontiac would capture 8 British forts during his time, and then we would name a car after him, right? Or an automobile company. You could drive a Pontiac. British retaliation. Not wanting to spend more money and fight another war, the British retaliated on Chief Pontiac's raids by giving the Indians smallpox-infected blankets. Yes, germ warfare, kind of like what we are looking at in Syria, I suppose, right now, in a different way. This eventually would weaken the tribes. If you are even just sick and not dead, because smallpox will kill you, as you saw in the pictures I showed you in the last presentation, you still can't fight that battle. Problems resulting from the War Proclamation Act of 1763. So again, I told you just a second ago, they had to pay for this war. Money has to be paid for wars. And so they wanted the colonists to pay because it was primarily fought over here. And so they thought, hey, your land, your problems, you're paying for it. So the Proclamation Act of 1763 established a line of the Appalachian Mountains that colonists could not cross to settle and expand the colonies. The debt issue was that England's debt rose from 72 million pounds to 132 million pounds. That red thing is a pound symbol instead of a dollar. To compensate, Parliament would place heavy taxes on the colonists. So here's what we have. That was the cause and the effect. The cause of the high taxes was basically the French and Indian War. The effect is that the colonists get these high taxes, and then they, of course, get very, very angry, as we all should with high taxes. When did the Revolutionary War start? The Revolutionary War started at dawn on April 19th, 1775. But, you know, the start of anything can be debatable. So that's why we kind of look at things. Some people feel it could be in 1770 with the Boston Massacre, or maybe it's with the Boston Tea Party, or maybe it's when the first tax was done. When, you know, you can argue and debate when a war starts, but you would have to support your idea. How long did the war last? The last battle of the war was fought in 1781. The Revolutionary War officially ended with another Treaty of Paris in 1783, but we're going to go through the whole war, so you can know who the participants were. Of course, it was England, Great Britain, whatever you want to call them, and then the colonists, and then we bring France in to help us, believe it or not. So why did the colonists want freedom? Because they wanted to avoid their heavy taxes. Taxation without representation did not make sense to them. How could you tax me if I can't vote against it? King George III and Parliament placed heavy taxes on the colonists to help pay for the war debt from the French and Indian War. Acts like the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act angered the colonists. Soon, Parliament passed more rules on the colonists. These acts together would become known as the Intolerable Acts. If you look to the left, it's called the Coercive Acts, and should be one of the major factors in the colonists' desire to declare independence. Long-distance relationship. Many colonists were not happy with the idea that they were 3,500 miles away, New York to London, and ruled by a country that had no interest in them. Colonists believed that they should not be taxed or considered even a part of the British Empire without representation in Parliament. It's kind of like their Congress. A famous quote that would develop with these ideas is, "No taxation without representation." The patriots were the American colonists that wanted freedom for Britain and were willing to fight and die for it. The loyalists were the American colonists that were loyal to Britain and opposed fighting for freedom. They liked their mother country. And so if you look at this particular slide, which you can see is a breakdown of those particular acts. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Act, the Tea Act, and the Coercive Acts, or the Intolerable Acts. Of course, the Stamp Act required stamps. The Sugar Act was a tax on most sugar things. The Stamp Act was a tax like on the colonist itself, whereas you buy this, you are taxed, whereas other things, and it just seems so, you know, strange that I'm going to get playing cards and I have to pay for a stamp on the playing cards, which is then, you know, it's just a pastime. Whereas other things were kind of taxes passed on to them. Like if you have a income tax, you are taxed directly. In Nevada, we do not have an income tax by the state, we only have it by the federal government. Townshend Acts, tax on glass, lead, paper, paint, tea imported into the colonies, and the Tea Act. Its principal overt objective was to reduce the massive surplus of tea held by the financially troubled British East India Company in its London warehouses and to help a struggling company survive, which of course leads to the Boston Tea Party, which then leads to the Intolerable Acts. All right, so as we go on from that slide, One of the other incidents that happens is the Boston Massacre. Now, is it a massacre when 5 people die? How many people have to die in order to make it an actual massacre? Well, if you use the name massacre, you convince people that they've been offended against. And so, in calling it a massacre, it makes people very angry. You can see Crispus Attucks, the first, well, at least they feel the first person to die. Everything's debatable in history. It was the killing of 5 colonists by British regulars. You can only see 4 tombstones over there because the next person didn't die for 2 weeks. It was the culmination of tensions in the American colonies that had been growing since the royal troops first appeared in Massachusetts in October of 1768. So could we argue that the war started in 1768? Maybe you could. To enforce the heavy tax burden imposed by the Townshend Acts. On March 5th, 1770, the 29th Regiment came to the relief of the 8th on duty at the Customs House, see the picture there, on King Street. The soldiers, led by Captain Thomas Preston, were met by the large and taunting crowd of civilians. Captain Preston was unable to disperse the crowd, and as they chanted, "Fire and we be damned," he ordered his troops, "Don't fire." With all the commotion, the soldiers probably did not hear his orders, and they opened fire on the crowd, killing 3 men instantly, and another 2 died later. Of course, one it took 2 weeks. Crispus Attucks, of African Indian descent, was killed, and possibly the leader, and the first one killed. And of course, one of the most famous, and now the Tea Party gets their title from this particular act, is the Boston Tea Party. And so the Boston Tea Party, initially referred to by John Adams from Boston as simply the destruction of the tea in Boston, was political protest by the Sons of Liberty in Boston, the city in the British colony of Massachusetts, against the tax policy of the British government and the East India Company that controlled all the tea imported into the colonies. On December 16, 1773, after officials in Boston refused to return 3 shiploads of taxed tea to Britain, a group of colonists boarded the ships and destroyed the tea by throwing it into the Boston harbor. The incident remains an iconic event of American history, and other political protests often refer to it. The Tea Party was the culmination of a resistance movement throughout the British America against the Tea Act, which had been passed by the British Parliament in 1773. Colonists objected to the Tea Act because they believed that it violated their rights as Englishmen. You know, Englishmen drink a lot of tea because it heats up their water, and then it kills all the microbes inside of that water, so that's why tea is so important. They weren't quite into coffee the way we are now. And also, if you look at that picture, you see a bunch of Native Americans, and you're like, why are the Native Americans doing it? I thought it was the Sons of Liberty. Well, to disguise themselves instead of, some people, when they commit crimes, they cover their faces, right? They wear masks, they pull pantyhose over themselves. So what they did at this point is they colored themselves to look like Native Americans. And that hid their identity, as well as, maybe they thought, oh, hey, we'll just sit there and they'll think it's the Native Americans doing this. But they knew it wasn't. Okay, so the First Continental Congress and King George's response to this. Okay, I totally just sneezed. Sorry. Date. The Congress met from September 15th, 1774 to October 26th, 1774. So you can see it's roughly a month or 2. And who was there and what was discussed. So this is when they try to get all of representatives from the colonies together to discuss, oh my gosh, this is happening. What are we going to do about it? Okay, George was not present. King George's response, King George ignored the complaints of the colonists. King George then sent General Gage to seize the American weapons. Okay, so King George wasn't going to be told what to do. There is a movie called The Madness of King George because he does start to go a little crazy. So, we mentioned General Gage. Well, by April 18th, 1775, General Gage is here, and he orders 700 British soldiers to Concord to destroy the colonist weapons depot because he was told to arrest the Massachusetts Provincial Congress. It's kind of like a state-controlled area, but he did not know where it was located. So if you look at that map, you can see where Boston is and Charlestown is. You can see the colonial troops, the colonial messengers, and the British troops. Okay, so you can watch that. Number 1 says April 19th, 1775, fighting begins at Lexington Common. And you have to understand that a lot of this stuff is happening through the night. And so, and time travels slowly. So they'll sit there and, you know, like we have it up there as the 18th, you know, when it's happening in the middle of the night. The guy starts riding out at 8, maybe gets there at midnight. So when do we say things happen? But know that it is around this time. Revere and William Dawes are sent from Boston to let the colonists know the British are coming, 1 if by land, 2 if by sea. You know, the lights were supposed to be hung in the Old North Tower. Revere reaches Lexington around midnight to warn, Samuel Adams and John Hancock. He and Dawes are stopped by the British on the way to Concord, but a third man, Samuel Prescott, makes it there to warn them. The shot heard around the world, and we'll talk about that again, was fired at Lexington. No one knows who fired it. At Lexington, 8 of 70 Minutemen are dead. On the way to Concord to find the ammunition, the British were fired upon, and the British were in retreat to Boston. Along the way, 99 of the British were killed, and 174 were wounded as the colonists fired on them from behind trees and rocks, using that guerrilla warfare we discussed from the French and Indian War.
The British are coming! The British are coming! Now the ride of Paul Revere set the nation on its ear, and the shot at Lexington heard round the world. When the British fired in the early dawn, the War of Independence had begun. The die was cast, the rebel flag unfurled, and on to Concord marched the foe to seize the arsenal there, you know, waking folks and searching all around. Till our militia stopped them in their tracks. At the old North Bridge we turned them back and chased those redcoats back to Boston town. And the shot heard round the world was the start of the revolution. The Minutemen were ready on the move. Take your powder, take your gun, report to General Washington. Hurry in, there's not an hour to lose.
Things that they had learned and their familiarity with that land, that the British did not have the familiarity with the land. So as you see this famous picture of Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and all of the members that wrote the Declaration of Independence, primarily you see the tallest one there, and known for his height, Thomas Jefferson. So we have to have a Second Continental Congress. Things are out of control. Things are crazy. What are we going to do? Okay, so Massachusetts is very involved because the majority of these violent acts are happening up there, and the majority of the resistant. You notice we're not mentioning Georgia, South Carolina, or North Carolina, or any of those places very often. Militiamen, a group of farmers that fought against the British at Lexington and Concord. Minutemen, farmers that were ready to fight in a minute's notice. Shot heard around the world. The mystery shot fired that started the American Revolution. May 10th, 1775. Fort Ticonderoga victory. American forces led by Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold, the future traitor of our country, captured Fort Ticonderoga in New York. The Americans get much needed cannons from the victory. Again, we have not declared our independence for over a year. It will still take that long. The Second Continental Congress is established because we need our representatives to come together to decide what's going to happen. John Hancock is the president. George Washington is named the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. All of the fighting at this time was in the north, and the southern states were reluctant to fight. The Declaration is not the beginning or end of the war. It is a statement to King George about how men are born free and deserve certain rights simply by birth. This was an arguable point considering slaves. Sorry about that typo. Thomas Jefferson wrote it and had many slaves, one of which he was in an intimate relationship named Sally Hemings up here on the right. This is the governing body when the war begins.
I remind Mr. Rutledge and Mr. Duane that blood has been shed. Massachusetts blood. While we debate, our militia is left without munitions, without arms, without even the slightest encouragement.
Dickinson of Pennsylvania.
One colony cannot be allowed to take its sister colonies headlong into the maelstrom of war. Parliament will be eager to call a halt to hostilities, as are we. They will seek conciliation. We must offer them an olive branch. I move this assembly consider a humble and dutiful petition be dispatched to His Majesty, one that includes a plain statement that the colony desires immediate negotiation and accommodation of these unhappy disputes, and that we are willing to enter into measures to achieve that reconciliation. Second.
Mr. Dickinson. The time for negotiation is past. The actions of the British Army at Lexington and Concord speak plainly enough. If we wish to regain our natural-born rights as Englishmen, then we must fight for them.
I have looked for our rights in the laws of nature and can find them only in the laws of political society. I have looked for our rights in the Constitution of the English government and found them there. Our rights have been violated, Mr. Adams. That is beyond dispute. We must provide a plan to convince Parliament to restore those rights. Do we wish to become aliens to the mother country? No! No, gentlemen. We must come to terms with the mother country. No doubt the same ship which carries forth our list of grievances will bring back their redress.
Mr. Dickinson.
My wife and young children live on the main road to Boston, fewer than 5 miles from the full might of the British Empire.
Should they sit and wait for Gage and his savages to rob them of their home, their possessions, their very lives? No, sir. Powder and artillery are the surest and most infallible conciliatory measures we can adopt.
If you exclude the possibility of peace, Mr. Adams, then I tell you no. You will have blood on your hands.
And I tell you, Mr. Dickinson, that to hold out an olive branch to Britain is a measure of gross imbecility.
If you New England men continue to oppose our measures of reconciliation, you will leave us no choice but to break off from you entirely and carry on the opposition in our own way.
Here. I sit in judgment on no man's religion, Mr. Dickinson. But your Quaker sensibilities do us a gross disservice, sir. It is one thing to turn the other cheek, but to lie down on the ground like a snake and crawl toward the seat of power in abject surrender. Well, that is quite another thing, sir. And I have no stomach for it, sir. No stomach at all.
We will exhaust all peaceful approaches, Mr. Adams. And we will do it with or without the approbation of you and your Boston insurrectionists.
Hear, hear. Mr. Dickinson's motion to send an olive branch petition to His Majesty has been made and seconded. We shall proceed to a vote.
New Hampshire.
Okay, so this is another battle that happens. It's very famous, the Battle of Bunker Hill, and it is in Boston, Massachusetts. So you can see this old map and where the battle happened, where Boston is. And you look at the picture, and you can see that the redcoats, the lobsterbacks, whatever you want to call them, are going up a hill, which is always the disadvantage in fighting. But so you read, the Americans had the high ground. American colonists had the high ground at the Battle of Bunker Hill. The colonists were not to shoot until they see the whites of their eyes, the whites of the British soldiers' eyes. They were low on ammunition, and the guns were not accurate at the distance. During this time period, you couldn't shoot it really far and actually hit your mark. And their leaders wanted each bullet to hit their mark. And it's very important if you don't have a lot of money and have a lot of extra ammunition to make sure your bullet is used wisely. The British make 3 rushes. The British soldiers attempted to storm Bunker Hill and capture it 3 different times. And so, we usually look at victories as who gets more land and who dies, who has the most deaths or least deaths. Battle of Bunker Hill took a toll on both sides. The Americans had 400 deaths, while the British suffered 1,000 deaths. And because of this, there was the Olive Branch Petition on July 5th. So again, we're looking at a year before the Declaration of Independence is written. The Second Continental Congress adopted the Olive Branch Petition. It hopes to gain a peaceful end to the war with Britain. King George refused the Olive Branch Petition. So we then have these people that are saying, they're, I don't want to say instigating, but definitely they're putting words out there, just I suppose like our news media does now, to incite feelings, to bring about, you know, emotion. And Thomas Paine and Patrick Henry are two of them. Thomas Paine writes Common Sense. There's a picture of him and Common Sense to the right. You can download Common Sense. It is a very small packet. It's, again, it's a pamphlet. Part of it is in your questions. Paine was a radical author that wrote the popular pamphlet Common Sense. Patrick Henry was remembered as the one of the most influential radical advocates of the American Revolution. Henry was most remembered for his fiery speeches that told colonists, give me liberty or give me death. If you download his speeches, they are amazing. Common Sense, a Revolutionary War pamphlet written by Thomas Paine, again to the right, criticized King George III and persuaded many colonists to believe in independence. You need that catalyst. You need people to kind of outline your thoughts, and that's what these two men were doing at the time. They were outlining and basically getting, you know, most of these people in the colonies were an uneducated group of people. They didn't go to school till they were 18. You know, they were lucky to learn to read and write a little bit. And so they had these amazingly educated men. Some say that there were more brilliant minds located in the area of the United States during this time than any other time on Earth. And so you have these brilliant minds coming together, and these individuals were people that were writing things and saying things that made other people go, you're right, that's how I feel. Oh, I was thinking something, but I had no words for it, or I didn't know how to articulate it, and you've done that for me. So France leads a hand. The British arrive in New York Harbor. France commits $1 million in arms to ammunition to the Americans who desperately needed them, thanks to Benjamin Franklin has a great relationship with the French. And the British arrive. June and July 1776, a massive British war fleet arrive in New York Harbor. The fleet included 30 battleships and over 30,000 soldiers under the command of General Howe. Imagine that pulling in to your area, these giant battleships and 30,000 soldiers. I mean, I think at that point you go, I think we're at war. So the Battle of New York, August 27th and 229th, 1776. Of course, the Declaration of Independence has been signed by now. Howe leads 15,000 soldiers against Washington's army. Washington, who is outnumbered 2-1, suffers defeat and must face total surrender. Never good, but he, of course, learned how to surrender while he was fighting the French Indian War. So if you look at the causes and effects up there, I know there's a question relating to that. And then Trenton, Princeton, and some more help. Surprise raid. This is my favorite. December 26, 1776. British takes 2,400 men across the Delaware River and executes a surprise attack on 1,500 German Hessians. Hessian is a paid soldier from another country. So when you're a mercenary. That's another name for the Hessians, or a type of mercenary. At Trenton, New Jersey. This served as a real confidence boost. And why is this such a big deal? Well, during this time, battles were not typically fought in winter. Why would you fight when it's freezing and your hours of daylight are so limited? And not only that, but George Washington, being the brilliant general that he is at this point, he goes, these people are partying all night long, and they are still drunk from Christmas. And so they, being inebriated, it's kind of like injecting people with smallpox. They can't fight. You know, they just can't get it together to pay attention. And so they are weakened by their partying, and so they can't fight. Another victory, a week later in Princeton, Washington gains another victory against the unprepared British force. Once morale is raised, once again the morale is raised within the army. So Marquis de Lafayette, a 19-year-old Frenchman that arrives in Philadelphia and volunteers to help the Americans. He has eventually became one of Washington's most trusted aides. And then the turning point for America, the British plan. The British plan to cut off New England from the rest of the colonies by attacking from the north and south. However, General Howe decided to sail south and capture Philadelphia without telling anyone. Without half the army knowing of the change of plans, the plan was destined to fail. Horatio Gates, American general that led the American forces In the Battle of Saratoga was a major turning point in the war. Gates would lead the Americans to a victory over General Bouillon's army. The British are marched to Boston and sent back to Britain. And the French allies. The news of the American victory at Saratoga, sorry about that missing S, spread quickly. The news got the French to join the cause on the side of the Americans. And so just kind of look at this. This is a great picture that shows you the advantages and disadvantages of each side. And I know I do ask a question about this on the review. Of course, the greatest advantage is fighting on home turf, right? It's like playing in your home stadium, a football game, when all your fans are there to help you and support you. So that is a huge advantage. And, you know, when those people from England, they probably are going, yeah, I kind of agree with you people. So if we look, we're in section 3, Valley Forge and the Traitor, the winter camp, December 17th, 1777. The Continental Army, led by George Washington, sets up winter camp at Valley Forge. The winter was extremely tough on the army. Morale was low. The people were walking away from the cause. A quote that was used at this time period was, "These are the times that try men's soul." Baron von Steuben, my mother is from Steubenville in the Ohio River Valley, German military man who joins the Continental Army and helps train them properly. He focuses on military technique and conditioning. So, Benedict Arnold, you don't want to be one of those. You don't want to be a Benedict Arnold because that's a traitor. One-time American general that turns on the Americans and joins the British side. Once his plans of surrendering his post to Britain was known amongst the American patriots, Arnold's contributions to the American independence are largely represented in popular culture, while his name becomes synonymous with the traitor in the 19th century. The demonization of Arnold began immediately after his betrayal became public. Biblical themes were often invoked. Benjamin Franklin wrote that Judas sold only one man, Arnold sold 3 million. And of course that analogy basically means that he sold all of the American colonists. If you look at the picture to the left, you can see how the forces were fighting, where they were fighting. Again, the majority of this is happening in the middle and northern colonies. Here is another set of battles to the right here, and please look at that as I read to the left. I know that these, there are dates that you will use in your review, so please pay attention. The war comes to an end. The French fleet in the Chesapeake. That's the Chesapeake Bay. Okay, so just look to the right as I read this. August 30th, 1781, the French fleet occupies the Chesapeake to block any possible British retreat at Yorktown. April 28th, 1781, George Washington and his 17,000 men begin the siege of Yorktown. The French fleet bombards the British army using their cannons throughout the day and night. October 17th, 1781, Britain surrenders to the colonists. Washington and Cornwallis work out the terms of the surrender. And again, we have to wait a while before the official treaty was written up. In 1783, we had to have a new country and a new name. We are now the United States of America.
Now at famous Bunker Hill, even though we lost, it was quite a thrill. The rebel Colonel Prescott proved he was wise. Outnumbered and low on ammunition as the British stormed his position, he said, "Hold your fire till you see the whites of their eyes." Though the next few years were rough, General Washington's men proved they were tough. Those hungry, ragged boys would not be beat. One night they crossed the Delaware, surprised the Hessians in their lair, and at Valley Forge they just bundled up their feet.
Now the shot heard round the world was the start of the revolution. The Minutemen were ready on the move. Take your blanket, take your son, report to General Washington. We've got our rights and now it's time to prove.
Well, they showed such determination that they won the admiration of countries across the sea like France and Spain, who loaned the colony ships and guns and put the British on the run and the Continental Army on its feet again. And though they lost some battles too, the Americans swore they see it through. Their raiding parties kept up hit and run. At Yorktown, the British could not retreat, bottled up by Washington and the French fleet. Cornwallis surrendered, and finally we had won.
Hooray! Long shot heard round the world to the end of the revolution. The Continental rabble took the day, and the father of our country beat the British there at Yorktown and brought freedom to you and me and the USA. God bless America. Let freedom ring.
And just as a summary from this chapter, some of the consequences of the American Revolution: about 7,200 Americans die in battle during the Revolutionary War, another 10,000 die from disease or exposure, and about 8,500 died in British prisons. A quarter of the slaves in South Carolina and Georgia escaped from bondage during the Revolution, and why wouldn't you? The northern states outlawed slavery or adopted gradual emancipation plans. The states adopted written constitutions that guaranteed religious freedom, increased the legislature's size and power, and made taxation more progressive, and reformed inheritance laws. Every state, and that means like women, used to not be able to inherit land, stuff like that. Number 4, every state wrote a state constitution. The Constitution of the United States is still years away from being written at this particular point. Virginia's included a list of rights, such as freedom of speech, religion, the right to bear arms. These rights became known as their Bill of Rights, which of course the United States adopts. Very similar. The first 10 amendments of the Constitution are the Bill of Rights. Voting rights expanded, not for women or African Americans, however. But it does go past just being for the rich landowners. If you could fight together and die together, you could vote together. So men, artisans and stuff could now vote. And freedom of religion or freedom from religion, however you want to look at it, states would not fund or pay for churches at this point. And churches could not dictate policy in politics. So a little bit more of that separation of church and state. Some of the American society and how it was affected with women at war and African Americans. Women took over running the family farm. Many traveled with the army. Believe it or not, they would go from battle to battle, cooking, washing, nursing. This actually went through the American Revolution. It's really about the First World War that this practice doesn't typically take place as much unless women are serving in a nursing capacity. They served as spies, couriers, which means they carried messages. And a few joined in the fighting. Deborah Sampson disguised herself as a man and served in the infantry for a year. Hannah Botswick McDougall initiated parades with the goal to free her arrested husband. And other women took part in violent protests, such as the food riots targeted against merchants who took advantage of the situation by increasing prices. African Americans, 1 in 20 soldiers were slaves. These men were simply listed as soldiers or slaves and did not have names on the enlistment papers. Some were infected deliberately with smallpox and sent to the enemy lines to infect the other soldiers. In the North, many were able to attain freedom, and states passed laws to do so. In the South, large plantations, farms, relied heavily on cheap labor to farm and would never think of emancipation. Emancipation, of course, being the freeing of these slaves. So obviously we are about 70 years away or so, 80 years away from the Civil War. There was a section in the Declaration of Independence that discussed freedom of slavery, and of course that was a very argued point, which you will see. And if you look at this timeline, this is just a basic timeline of where things happen, and it of course is a review of major dates, and it will be asked on your review.